Thanks everybody for making it to the last day. My title is different than what's in the program because I actually went and reworked my talk a little bit after seeing all the wonderful talks this week. I'm going to talk about two different projects that I've been involved with on machine learning for climate modeling. And I think both will have interest to this group based on some of the really nice discussions we've had so far. So I'll talk first about some parameter calibration and emulation work I've done with a land model, and then I'll talk about what's in the program, which is the feature detection of extreme precipitation events. So starting with the parameter calibration work, this is work that I did with Ben Sanderson, Rosie Fisher, and Dave Lawrence. So actually, thanks, Jacqueline, for setting up the carbon cycle for my talk. It's very nice to see the terrestrial biosphere featured. So I think I'll use this pointer that Mike was using. So I love starting with this figure, which is from a MIP. It's from C4 MIP, which is a carbon cycle MIP. And so each of the lines in this plot are different Earth system models, all forced by the same future climate scenario, RCP 8.5, projecting into the future to 2100. What's plotted on the y-axis is the annual flux of carbon to or from the land, such that if it's positive, so here's the 0 line, that means the land is taking up carbon. If it's negative, the land is emitting carbon. So what's really interesting about this is you see all these different models by the end of the century. Not only is there disagreement in the magnitude, but also disagreement in the sign, implying that the land could be either a sink or source of carbon, which obviously has very large, important implications for the global carbon cycle. And what folks have found is that a lot of this spread is due to uncertainty in land model structure and parameters. And in particular, I'm going to focus on the parametric uncertainty that we've already heard about a little bit this week in different talks. And so the reason that we have all this uncertainty is basically that land models are very complicated and they're very heavily parameterized, and there's a lot of subgrid scale heterogeneity that they're trying to represent. So this is just a nice overview figure of the land model that I'll be looking at, which is CLM, which is the land component of NCAR's CESM model. So these models are trying to represent everything from surface energy fluxes to hydrology, and then also biogeochemistry, and variation among grid cells and plant types. So there's a lot of heterogeneity, there's a lot of variation in parameterized processes, and that leads to uncertainty when we don't exactly have perfect observations to inform our values for these parameters. And so our question was, could we use machine learning to sort of help with this parameter calibration or tuning process? And so as some of you may know, hand tuning parameter values takes a long time. It takes a lot of human time and computer time, lots of trial and error. Sometimes it becomes like a game of whack-a-mole, if you know that arcade game where you fix one thing and then it breaks something else in the model. So Rosie made this diagram kind of showing how you sometimes have to take a very complex and windy path to model calibration. So we were wondering if we could use machine learning to help streamline this process and make it more efficient. So the basic setup here is that we're using neural networks as land model emulators. So the input to the neural network will be various parameters in the land model that we've determined to be important or highly sensitive. And then the output will be based on land model predictions. So I'll talk about the training data on the next slide, but this setup is somewhat flexible, but the results are very much dependent on the specific parameters and the specific output fluxes that we're looking at in the land. But it is very adaptable to other processes. And then the idea of using the neural network here is that it can be much faster than running the full land model globally. So we can then use a trained emulator to sample the parameter space much more efficiently. So generating the training data, I ran an ensemble of model simulations where I sampled across 6 different biophysical parameters Why did I use 6 and what are those 6 parameters could be an entire talk on its own. Parameter selection is a really interesting and fascinating field. So, but without going into too much detail, I used a Latin hypercube sampling to span the parameter space evenly across those 6 parameters, generated an ensemble member for each of those parameter samplings. And these are offline land-only simulations forced by atmospheric reanalysis, but they are run globally. And then the particular outputs that I was looking at are carbon and water fluxes and the variability in them. So what I'm doing is I'm taking a global field output from the model of either GPP, gross primary production, or latent heat flux, and I'm calculating the first 3 principal components of those fields as a way of getting being able to train the network to predict single values, but not just predicting the global mean. So trying to account for some of the spatial variability in those fields. So again, returning to this picture, but adding a little bit more detail here. So I mentioned how I'm training using a set of 6 input parameters, and I have 100 samples from my perturbed parameter ensemble. And I use something pretty simple, pretty straightforward, just a 2-layer feed-forward artificial neural network. So this is a supervised learning problem, and it's a regression problem. And so my output that I'm training to predict, it comes from that perturbed parameter ensemble. And so here I'm just showing the first 3 modes of variability for GPP. So again, this is like photosynthesis. Yeah, question. Mm-hmm.
How did you decide and why for 3 principal components?
I really just kind of cut it off at 1 or 2% of the variability explained. So after that, it's pretty noisy, and we felt like it would be difficult to emulate those very insignificant modes.
Okay, it wasn't accounting for much variability, the other ones. Okay.
Right. Mm-hmm. Cool. Okay. Right, so I wanted to kind of feature a little bit of some of the interpretability that we did for this work, so I think that might be interesting to folks here. So after we have a trained neural network, we can ask questions like, which of the input variables are most important to the skill of the network? And so because I'm working in a parameter space, I could ask the question, which of the input parameters are most important to the skill of predicting these various fluxes? So I'm going to show plots here that look at the variable or feature importance, both for the first PC of GPP and also latent heat flux. And so how this works is you randomly shuffle the values of one parameter at a time, preserving others, and you test the performance of the emulator. So I'm going to be showing some bar plots where if the bar is larger, that means that parameter is more important to the predictive skill of the emulator, because as you remove the information in that parameter, the error increases. And so what I find really interesting about this is that there's different parameters that are important for the 2 different fluxes. In particular, what really jumps out here for GPP is one parameter in particular, and I know I haven't talked specifically about what the parameters are, but they're mainly biophysical parameters. This parameter happens to be related to plant hydraulic stress, so the movement of water through plants. There's a really nice paper by Daniel Kennedy that talks about that parameterization in the model. But then when you look at latent heat flux, you see a much different picture in terms of the importance of the different parameters. In particular, this parameter Medlin slope is very important, which has to do with stomatal conductance in the land model. But the point I want to make is that this, now that we're kind of expanding this work, this helped us to go back and scrutinize the range of values for some of these parameters, in particular, how they vary across plant types, and also the relationships between the parameters. So it has helped inform sort of the next iteration of this sort of parameter uncertainty work. So skipping ahead a little bit here, but in the interest of time, our general approach, which is sort of a variation on what Tapio talked about yesterday, is to emulate, calibrate, test. So on the left here, I'm showing just a way of measuring skill of the emulator. So comparing the predictions from the neural network versus the actual model output for a particular metric. And then we want to bring in the observations to actually do the calibration. So I'm skipping over a little bit here, but basically what we have is 6 targets for calibration. We have carbon and water fluxes, and we have the first 3 modes of variability for each of those. So it's not just as simple as saying, okay, let's look at this one metric and find the parameters that best fit the observations to that one metric. But we can still do it. We can still build a cost function that accounts for all 6 of those, targets, and ask the question of the emulator, give me the best, in heavy quotation marks, best fit parameters to observations, to minimize the distance between the emulator predictions and the observations themselves. And then we can take that best fit parameter set and run it back through the full land model to test it. So that's the test step. And that's what I'm showing here on the left. So this is looking at GPP globally after we've run sort of the optimized version of CLM relative to observations. And I'm plotting on the right here the default model bias so that you have a sense of where we're starting from. So no changes in parameters. What does the model look like for GPP? And so you can see it gets better in some regions and maybe worse in others. Again, this is the difficulty with globally calibrating a land model. And it's very much dependent on the 6 parameters that I chose. And of course, which outputs we're calibrating to. But I kind of wanted to, this is sort of where the paper here ends, but I kind of wanted to take that a step further. So we've been playing around with parameter distributions, because you might say, well, why not generate a set of parameter distributions instead of a single set of values? And so you can use something like Markov chain Monte Carlo to do that. So these are the parameter posterior distributions for the 6 parameters when we don't just say we want a single set of values, but we want a distribution. And then one of the things that I'm playing around with, how to sort of understand this variation in parameters, is to then run them through a different neural network that's been trained to emulate the future climate response of a land surface model. And then what we can do with that is we can compare the changes in carbon and water fluxes accounting for parameter uncertainty. So what I mean by that is the blue distribution here is the full parameter space of the full range of parameter values that we think were possible, the full minimum and maximum range. And this is the global mean change in GPP and change in latent heat flux. But the red distributions are when we give it the parameter posterior distributions. So we can kind of start to say, how much can we reduce the spread of possible changes in carbon and water fluxes by calibrating those parameters to observations.
With your MC, you're estimating, you're showing marginal distributions, but you're estimating joint distributions.
Yeah.
So the posteriors aren't actually from data, they're from some Markov chain simulation?
Which does have built into it a cost function that uses the observations to minimize the distance between the emulator predictions and the observations. Any other questions?
So the previous slide, it seems that the original model was overestimating something, right? Or underestimating it, and the new model overestimate or underestimate, okay, right? So is it clear why and whether there is something in between that you can use?
Yeah, so I think what you're probably seeing is the Amazon. And I think what's happening is so the emulator wants to pull everything closer to observations, but we do have this kind of rather complex space because we have these 6 targets for calibration. So it's getting pulled in different directions. And I think it's using the Amazon as a big lever to pull, even though I'm doing PCA and I'm not just saying, let's fit the global mean, it's using that sort of important carbon flux location to pull the model in a direction that it thinks is best fit to observations. And this is what I mean by it's so difficult to calibrate these models globally when you have lots of moving targets. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, sorry for stupid question, but so you do it in PC space. So is it like time series you are trying to fit, or?
Oh, no, that's a great question. I didn't mention the time aspect of it. I've taken an annual mean of the climate model output before I've done the PCA. So we are not really including time in this analysis, but that's something that we would like to do, is to go back and include month as another dimension of variation, because especially for the land, the seasonal cycle really matters. So.
Mm-hmm. And the follow-up question, so is it on the assumption that EOF do not change when you sample parameter space and in observations?
Sorry, say that again?
I mean, when you do PCA analysis and you do this, apply your technique, so is it assuming that EOFs do not change?
Yeah, so it's looking at the variation. I know a lot of times we use EOFs in the time variation in climate data, but it's looking at the variation across the ensemble members. And the difference in the ensemble members is that they have different biophysical parameter values, because we think each of those values are equally likely a priori. We don't make any assumptions about the prior distributions of the parameters. So yeah, time is not really accounted for. It's more looking at the variation in the biophysics because of the changes in parameter values.
Okay.
Okay, cool.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, microphone.
You said you don't use any prior information on the distribution of the parameters, but then now you have a posterior. You then use that as a prior for the next.
Absolutely.
Steps?
Yeah, that's what we're kind of playing around with how to best apply these posterior distributions. But yeah, going into it, we didn't want to necessarily make any assumptions because we didn't have any reason to assume a Gaussian distribution for some of these parameters. We really don't know for some of them, some of the very empirical parameters. At best, we have, minimum, maximum values that we can kind of sample from, but yeah.
So is that something you've done then, and now that you kind of trust those posterior distributions, or?
Yeah, not really beyond just playing around with this toy problem of the emulated future climate response, but well, what we have done is modify some of the parameter ranges for some follow-up experiments. So just shifting the minimum and maximum values. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Cool. All right, I think in the interest of time, I'll move on to the next project, which is something completely different, but I think also very relevant to this group. And so here we wanted to leverage all the work that's been done in feature detection for extremes. And some of this has already been discussed in some of the other talks, but also connect it to extreme precipitation and how that might change with climate change. And so this is work with John Truesdale, Jim Baird, Ken Kunkel, Maria Molina, and Jerry Meal. So I don't have to dwell too much on the motivation here, but we know that extreme precipitation has significant consequences, and it also comes from a large variety of sources. Those in California are very familiar with atmospheric rivers, along with flooding after tropical cyclones. So we'd like to better understand and distinguish the sources of extreme precipitation, as well as how it might change with climate change. And so some of you may have seen this paper from Marcus Reichstein et al., but I sort of like this diagram of how different machine learning tasks could be applied to earth science. So we're thinking about a pattern classification or feature detection task here. And our goal is to both apply and develop different machine learning based detection algorithms to automate the classification of some of these different event types. So I'll talk a little bit today about atmospheric rivers and tropical cyclones. Maria is also working on a detection algorithm for mesoscale convective systems, which is like very strong thunderstorms in the Midwest. And then I'll also spend some time, if I have it, talking about frontal detection. But then the second part that's really important is connecting these events that are detected in climate models and observations to extreme precipitation events. So I think Anish touched on the ClimateNet project, which is a Berkeley Lab project where they built this community sourced data set based on experts, climate experts, actually going in and labeling climate model output for atmospheric rivers and tropical cyclones. So this animation is kind of showing how you might do that for a tropical cyclone. There's a paper by Pravat et al., which talks about a lot of the details of the CNN architecture that they're using here. And I just want to acknowledge Karthik and Arvind for their help with this work. And so we'd like to apply this trained network to our climate model output, and specifically fully coupled CESM simulations at high spatial and temporal resolution. So when I say high spatial resolution, I mean about a 1/4 degree, and high temporal resolution, I mean between 3 and 6 hourly output. So the first question was, can we apply this trained algorithm to the climate model output and actually detect these events? And it turns out we can, which is great. So this is a little animation showing the detected atmospheric rivers and tropical cyclones. You can see the different input fields that were used. There's some interesting things to observe, like this tropical cyclone spinning off into an atmospheric river that we want to kind of dig into a little bit more. But there's lots of interesting things to look at here. The one aspect that I'll feature has to do with atmospheric river detection. So Anish touched on this as well, but there's another MIP called ART-MIP, which has to do with atmospheric river tracking and detection that one of my colleagues, Christine Shields, is very involved with. And so this is a paper from the ART-MIP studies that's comparing a variety of different detection methods for an atmospheric river. And so they have different thresholding, relative versus absolute thresholds. So it's not too surprising that they vary. But the point that we pulled out from this was that many of them depend often only on a single field, which is this integrated water vapor transport field, to detect atmospheric rivers. Whereas previously, I was showing something that used 4 different input fields. So our question was, ClimateNet was trained on these 4 different input fields. That includes that vertically integrated precipitable water, but also pressure and winds. And so the question was, what happens when we change the input fields? And I want to give John Truesdale a special shout out for helping with the training and retraining here. And so this is just the same animation that I showed previously. If we retrain on only a single input field, which is that vertically integrated precipitable water, we're not able to detect tropical cyclones, but we're still able to detect atmospheric rivers with very similar spatiotemporal representation. So that's kind of a nice way to bring in some of the domain knowledge from the atmospheric river detection projects and show that we don't actually need all those variables to detect atmospheric rivers. Okay, moving right along to the front detection work, because I've been spending a lot of time working with Jim and Ken on this. So they developed, a couple of years ago, they developed a machine learning detection algorithm for fronts and weather systems. And the details are in this paper. It's also a CNN-based architecture, but basically it takes as input 5 different surface fields, and it outputs 4 different frontal categories, as well as sort of a background none. And in their paper, they showed that they were able to successfully detect 90% of the manually labeled fronts over North America. So there's a couple important things there. One is that there is a data set that exists through the National Weather Service that has human labeled fronts. Without that, it would be a lot more difficult to have trained their model. The other important caveat is that we are now limiting our spatial domain to North America, just because that's where the labeled data exists. So you'll see that on the next couple of slides. But our question was, again, can we use the pre-trained front detection algorithm to detect weather fronts in a climate model? And again, we're using CESM, fully coupled, high resolution simulations here. And so we can, which is great, we can detect these different front types using the CESM output. But of course, your next question might be, how do we validate the climate model results? How do we know that the climate model detected fronts are realistic? So we've been thinking a lot about how to do this. And as I mentioned, it's fortunate that we have a labeled data set to work with. So this is just comparing the CESM output on the right here with this labeled data set from the National Weather Service. It's called the Coded Service Bulletin, or CSB. So comparing the front locations from those two data sets at a random time point, which isn't particularly useful because we wouldn't expect the model to perfectly match this observational data set at a specific time. But we can look at statistics across time and see if we can get some good comparison. So that's what I'm showing here, the bar plot. Now I'm sort of aggregating the results into these seasonal front crossing rate climatologies. So what I mean by that is how often is a front crossing a particular grid point, breaking that down by season and averaging across the continental US. So CSM is in orange and the labeled data set is in blue. And you can see that there's pretty good agreement between the two, at least when we aggregate the data in this way. But we can look at that spatially too. So these are some spatial plots comparing the units here are fronts per week. So again, the front crossing rates between the labeled data set on the left and CESM on the right. Maybe some under prediction in CESM, but pretty good agreement. And we wanted to do this because we wanted to make sure that we were validating the CESM output so that we could then compare across the response to climate change. So what I'm showing here is now just CESM, so just front detection with CESM, no labeled data set. This is the present day climatology, and this is the climatology of an RCV 8.5 simulation at the end of the century. So some shifts in the patterns, it's maybe easier to look at it like this. This is the delta. So one thing that popped out to us here is just the possible westward shifts in the winter and spring, and then maybe a northward shift in JJA. So we wanted to kind of understand what are some possible mechanisms here. Why is the climatology of fronts changing when we look across climate change? And one idea we have is the sort of the jet response to climate change. So it's a paper from Barnes and Screen in 2015, looking at the North Atlantic jet latitude response as a function of month in CMIP5 models. So comparing end of the century, RCV 8.5, and more present day climate. So the takeaway here is that you do see a lot of spread. This is still a very open hypothesis for how the jet is going to respond to climate change, but you do see some possible shifts in the summer, northern hemisphere summer. This is jet latitude response, so some possible northward shifts. And so what we're thinking is that possibly this decrease in fronts that's observed in the summer could be related to the northern retreat of the jet stream. But we still need to dig into this response more and also try and test the detection of the machine learning fronts in other CMIP models. So I will mention that the limiting factor is often getting 3 hourly resolution output from these high resolution models is somewhat limiting to the success of being able to apply this. Okay, I have only a few minutes left, but I do want to bring it connected to the precipitation extremes. And so what I mean by that is we have all of these labels from our climate model output, these different features, for example, different front types, but we can also look at precipitation in the model as well. And we can sort of ask the question, when do fronts that are detected by the machine learning algorithm line up with extreme precipitation events? So after some data processing, that's sort of what I'm showing here. So let me try to explain what I've done here. I'm looking at the percent of extreme precipitation grid points that line up with a front, just overlapping grid points. And so this is for the present day climatology in the model. So you can see that in some parts of the US, as you might expect, there's very few fronts and extreme precipitation events. And in other parts, it could be 40 to 50% of the extreme precipitation, at least based on the machine learning detection, is coming from a front. And then on the right, this is the same calculation, but for the climate change simulation. So again, it's easier to look at the delta, which then you sort of see, okay, this dipole response that pops out, where there's some increases in the southwestern US off the coast, and sort of a stronger decrease in the southeastern US. So we're still trying to dig into this response in terms of why we would expect decreases in extreme precipitation events attributed to fronts with climate change in different regions. And we've looked at this seasonally as well. So this is just a breakdown by season. But I think what's important here is that we're kind of convolving two different things in these maps. And one of them is the changes in fronts with climate change, which I already showed. And the other one is just the changes in extreme precipitation, independent of fronts. So that's what I'm attempting to plot here. But again, the metric is percent extreme precipitation grid points. So it's a little bit messy, it's a little bit noisy. But basically, we're trying to break down this response and look at whether something like a decrease in the southeastern US is driven by changes in fronts or just changes in general extreme precipitation. So I just have a few more slides that are kind of going to be a little bit more broader because I want to mention some ongoing work. I think this came up already in one of the talks, but there's a NCAR Hewlett-Packard collaboration that has to do with building infrastructure for better being able to integrate Python and machine learning tools with our Fortran-based climate models. And this is called SmartSim. And so our interest in this work is, could we apply this tool to do online learning or online detection? I didn't really go into it, but part of the challenge of working with this big data, with this high resolution output, is that we can't even host it locally. Some of the runs were done years ago. So we're trying to dig up all this data. We've got to do extensive data processing on it in order to come up with something like this. So if we could run the detection while the climate model is running, that would be awesome. So that's kind of one idea we have for applying something like this. And then the last thing I want to mention is a new project that I've been involved with at NCAR. And it's called the Earth System Data Science Initiative. And so what we're trying to do here is we're realizing that more and more of our time as scientists, climate modelers, is consumed by data wrangling. We should be sharing and reusing more code than we do. And this is sort of not allowing us to be as well poised to tackle AI and ML, which is, I think, the relevance to this group. So we have sort of this initial working group, which spans across my lab, Climate and Global Dynamics, as well as the Computational Information System Lab at NCAR. We have a lot of great tools at our disposal, some of which you may recognize. And our vision is basically to build these connections both across between scientists and also across scientists and software engineers, which is, I think, very relevant to this group. So I'm happy to talk about that more. So I'll just end with a one-sentence summary of each of the projects I talked about, but sort of wanting to emphasize that we're using machine learning to hopefully enhance and inform knowledge discovery, increase computational efficiency, and understand uncertainties. So it's really a tool in our toolbox for climate modelers, I think. And then just a quick shout out to some of the other CESM related machine learning projects that are going on at NCAR. I've probably not even captured all of them because it's growing so fast. So thanks very much for your attention. Happy to take questions.
Okay.
Thanks, really great work. About the fronts, you said that 90% of the fronts were detected in the label data set. Is that the same label data set that was used for training?
No, so they used, this is a paper that I wasn't a part of, but they used mirror reanalysis for training. And they, I mean, I'm sure they did some sort of test validation split of the labels that came from the National Weather Service.
Okay, because that was also when you went and compared the fronts found from the climate model to the fronts found in the benchmark. The benchmark was not used for training by the model, right?
It was used for training by the original model. What we did was apply the trained model to something that it hadn't seen before, which is climate model output. And the best way that we could sort of think to validate that climate model output was to go back to the labeled data set. But I guess maybe what you're asking is that then circular kind of coming back to that same labeled data set?
It's only going to make your method look worse, your transfer method look worse. So that would be an acceptable comparison, but maybe not that revelatory.
Yeah, finding validation data is a challenge, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, great talk and really nice work, Katie. I also had a question about the fronts and the figure you showed about the climate change and extreme precipitation related to fronts. So is some of the Southwest US signal associated with fronts also associated with atmospheric rivers, which a lot of times tend to align with fronts and extratropical cyclones? And a second part of the question is, like, you have very different precipitation with cold fronts where it's narrow and extreme versus warm fronts. It's a broader region that may not align exactly where the front is, but just ahead of the front, right? So have you thought about extending your detection method to detect precipitation surrounding the regions of the front rather than just co-located but neighboring grid points? Or
Yeah, we have thought about both of those aspects as really good points, and especially after talking with Ken Kunkel about his work on detecting different extremes, and what he was finding was they were dominated by fronts, but they had to sort of expand their geographic region, just like what you were saying. So yeah, absolutely, I'd like to make that methodology a little more sophisticated than just overlapping. I have done some preliminary work comparing the ClimateNet or the CGNet AR masks to extreme precipitation. But of course, there's still two different machine learning models. So the other thing that Maria and I have talked about is trying to build a detection algorithm that would account for multiple event types in a single machine learning algorithm. And maybe that would help get at some of those other points about conflating different event types.
Hi, thank you for that. I have a question about the last stuff we were talking about with training. Is yes by the sharing of code. Here we go. The question is, are you planning to have any training for the community to use the code? Because it's one thing to have it available and have the data available versus having like knowledge. So is there going to be like tutorials, hackathons? And is this going to be done through Pythia since you have their logo here?
Is it going to be done? What was the last
through
part?
Project Pythia.
Yes, exactly. I was just going to reference you to Project Pythia. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, a lot of these folks are the Project Pythia members. Yeah.
Thanks.
Oh, go ahead, please. I want to ask about the first part. So all the questions that are related to the last part should go first, I think. Okay, I'm about the first part as well. Okay, then I'll go. I was trying to wrap my head around what space. So you did these principal components in space, but unlike the fluid part, you know, the land model doesn't really talk to one another. I guess there's a little bit of conversation with river flow, but more or less, each land model is run independently. And so I was trying to wrap my head around what a principal component in space means. And I guess it means some amount of shared history and some amount of shared parameters and some amount of shared conditions. But I was just wondering if there was a way to think about it that wasn't explicitly spatial, given that there's very limited information.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I look at the accompanying spatial patterns, I don't think I have the slide, to the distributions, EOF1 is like clearly a tropical signal. So I do think that you get some of the regionality of, especially with carbon and water fluxes, preserved in that. But again, that's why I think it would be interesting to go back and include month as an additional variant and not just average out the seasonal cycle.
But in this context, doesn't tropics mean, yeah, it's not related particularly to latitude and longitude. It's related to a similarity in some other space, some probably lower dimensional space, right? Because it's
well, it's looking across the ensemble members of the PPE. So
I guess what I'm saying is that I think that the spatial signature is probably expressing something that's more that is common in a lower dimension than space than that, because it's talking about similar parameters in the land model.
Yeah.
So or similar land surface types to be specific.
Yeah.
Similar conditions to which it's subject, right? Hot and wet, rainy, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think that's why we see. It's part of why we see certain parameters dominate the skill for the emulator. One thing I didn't have time to talk about is there is some variation in plant type accounted for in the parameter sampling as well, but that's not the case for all the parameters. So we had to kind of normalize some of that out while allowing for different parameter value, different plant types to have different parameter values. But I do wonder how much that approximation also impacts the PCA overall. Yeah.
Hey, thanks for the talk. This is Edwin Blanchard. I was wondering, so for the emulator problem, you do Latin hypercube sampling of the parameter space, right? Can you speak a little bit to how big the space is and how fast it is to generate an output for a particular sample?
Oh, sure. So I think if I understand your question, do you mean how fast the emulator is?
No, how fast the actual simulation is.
Oh, the land model simulations themselves. Yeah, so a lot of that depends on things like how complex of a representation are you using, your spatial resolution of the land model itself, whether or not you're running active carbon nitrogen cycling, which increases the spin up time. So the short answer is, for the types of simulations I was running, my ensemble members, I limited the complexity. I ran at fairly low resolution. And so those simulations took a couple of hours each. And I was only running for 20 years because that's pretty much the shortest amount of time you can run this version of the land model to equilibrate to the parameter changes.
Yeah, right. Just to follow up on that, have you considered the possibility of using some sort of active learning algorithm instead of LHS to do to speed up the figuring out of what parameter directions might be more active in the output of the model?
No, that would be interesting to think about. Again, we didn't want to assume any prior distributions, so they're just sampled uniformly. But maybe that could also help with the parameter selection problem as well.
Yeah, I guess that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah. Cool, thank you.
Yep.
Very nice talk. Going back to again the first part, I was wondering if, and this is more of a general question, I don't know if it actually even applies to the land model. It's just about hearing so much work about trying to tune parameters. There has been some work done, David Nealon did quite a bit of that, showing that there is kind of a functional form that is usually quite easy that describe how most parameters, I mean, the cost function for pretty much most parameters in climate science is usually a parabolic structure. And it's relatively simple to find that out. I mean, we try with a relatively simple model, but David then worked on GFDL, and that was pretty much the same thing. So I was wondering if that kind of information could actually be used, because it's kind of informing. I mean, there is a physical and mathematical base for why you expect something that simple in most cases, and it's essentially just that you have a very complicated system, and so you end up having very simple function at the end because of the number of degrees of freedom that you have. But if you could use that information, I think that the machine learning would be, first of all, faster, because you would have a description of what your changes would be according to your cost function, but also a little bit more informed by the physics, or at least the sum of the I mean, you could also see when a parameter, for example, goes off significantly, or I'm always a little bit afraid that the machine learning then is doing a great fit, but what is the meaning of that? Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a complex space. I think we've seen that in the attempts to calibrate their parameters. Yeah, and the other thing is that I think the results would change a lot if they were different parameters, if there were more of them. So I think we have to be really careful about like what our goals are. I don't know, maybe this is a little bit broader than what you were asking, but my goal was not to ask for the next best version of the land model because we've now perfectly calibrated these parameters, but more to kind of explore the feasibility of doing something a little bit more automated and structured and removing some of the subjectivity out of tuning that is very pervasive often. So I don't know if I answered your question, but thanks for the point about that work. Yeah.
Question from Duncan for Zoom.
Hi, thanks. Very nice talk, Katie. Oh, actually, it follows up quite nicely from that talk on the floor. Often in these kind of calibration emulation approaches, we use Gaussian processes to do the emulation, not least because they give you uncertainties. And I wondered if you explored that at all, and if not, how you, or if you incorporated some kind of measure of uncertainty from your emulator in the MCMC steps.
Yeah, great question. Haven't explored Gaussian process models. We were able to find pretty good skill with the artificial neural networks, so we kind of stuck with that, at least for this proof of concept, but would like to compare different emulation methods in the future. And then that was actually, emulator uncertainty was a question I had for your talk, as well as the structural uncertainty piece, because I've always sort of wondered about how to account for that in the cost function, especially when you're looking across a single model and a single PPE. So no, other than sort of just accounting for normalizing by the percent variance of the different modes, and also the variability in the observations. Those are the other things that go into the cost function. We don't have an explicit representation of emulator uncertainty, but I suppose you could do that by, producing an ensemble of emulators and then looking across how different neural networks could model that.
That'd be interesting. Yeah, it'd be good to chat more with you about this at some point.
Yeah, great.
I'm not sure who asked the question before me, but it'd be great if she might post the paper she was referring to in Slack, because I'd be interested in that as well. Thank you.
Okay, great. So we'll come back after lunch for 2 more talks, and let's thank Katie and all the speakers one more time.